Welcome to Behind the Radio, Season 3.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the world, and welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Jazwa, and this is Behind the Radio for episodes 6 and 7, also known as parts 1 and 2 of our deep dive into the Franklin cover-up. I have a small confession to get out of the way before we really dive in tonight. When I cover stories like this, I always start with the evidence, so any declassified documents, trial transcript, any autopsy reports that are involved, photographic evidence, all that good stuff. And I try to start building, like I've told you before, the narrative based on that, rather than relying on some secondary sources or summaries or my own thoughts on the topic or any of that. I do that because I genuinely feel like the evidence should shape the story rather than that being the other way around. But in doing so, however, there are times when I will hold back certain details on occasion. That is because I feel that by giving those any earlier than I do, it could introduce bias into the story before I'm actually giving you guys all the information and just allowing you to make up your own mind about it. This series is no different. There are two main points that I omitted from parts 1 and 2, which I'll be sharing with you exclusively here tonight. And these are two incidents that I feel greatly move the needle on the story, definitely towards it being a systemic cover-up, and also seemingly point towards a larger network. More on that in a minute, though. How are you beautiful people today? I'm doing pretty good myself, busy as always. I'm still trying to come to grips with some of the things that I uncovered throughout the course of this series. Part 3 is coming, by the way. I'm still trying to locate a few key documents that we need to finish this up, but I've stayed hard at it. I wanted to get it out next week, but I pretty quickly realized that it was going to take at least 2 weeks to try and finish the investigation right and fact check it again and get it recorded and edited and produced and all that. So I'm currently eyeing about 2 weeks out from today, but I will keep you all posted about it. If you don't already and have any interest in doing so, go ahead and give me a follow on TikTok at clandestine_radio or at Jazwa from CRP on X. And just type the show name into Facebook or pretty much anywhere else. And that's a good way for us to connect over on social medias. And I do my very best to drop exclusives on each one of those and to keep everyone up to date with things like that when the actual episode will be dropping. I'm definitely most active on Facebook or starting to be on TikTok at this point. Which, if you know me or you have listened to this for a while, you no doubt know that I fought tooth and nail and did not want to get on there. It pains me to admit that it was actually one of the best moves that I've made for the show so far. So if you did find us on there, leave a little comment and let me know, and I'll follow you back. Well, that's about all that I have up front here. I've got 2 bombshells from parts 1 and 2 that I want to get into pretty quick, as well as I've got 2 news stories that we've touched on briefly before, well, one of them. But there's been some recent updates to it, and I never really discussed it at length on here, I don't believe, so... And I would say they both relate to this current series too, in a way. And if you can't tell, I'm very much shooting from the hip here on this one. It's not going to be one of those overproduced, scripted episodes, so bear with me. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, first off, if you haven't heard the episodes yet, then you may not get the significance of what I'm about to talk about here, and it might potentially bias your opinion on the story before you have all the info, so I guess consider this a spoiler warning. I'll leave that up to you. The first thing that I want to discuss takes us right back to July 1990, and it was in the wake of Franklin's lead investigator Gary Caradori's mysterious plane crash that ended up killing him and his 8-year-old son AJ. And it may be pertinent to remind you all that the early reports and tons of local rumors that I came across all suggested that the FBI arrived on the crash scene and were gone whenever the first responders arrived, or left shortly thereafter. And the only thing that was known to have been on that flight that wasn't recovered, either whole or in part, was Caradori's evidence briefcase that he had stated to Schmidt and to others contained that final damning piece of evidence that he needed in order to bring charges against those that were involved in that elite child trafficking ring, which was at least partially comprised of some photos that, according to King's photographer, Rusty Nelson, he had actually met Caradori in Chicago to hand those over to him. Well, as crazy as all of that is, there was another well-documented incident that would seem to implicate the FBI into the broader cover-up, even more so than that. The plane crash occurred on July 11th, but the very next day, Caradori's grieving widow, so Sandy Caradori, went up to Gary's office in Lincoln, Nebraska. And again, this is the very next day after the crash. This is before her husband or her young son's bodies were even returned from Illinois. And I guess she was up there. I couldn't find anything specific that said the reason that she went up to the office. My guess is either to put together the pieces of what might have happened to cause this, or to attempt to gather any sort of needed documents that she had to get to handle his affairs. Again, that part's just kind of a guess, but everything else is based on what she said and other contemporary sources. But she would first notice that there was a blacked out vehicle parked at the office, and she didn't recognize it, so, it's kind of been a lot of weird things going on, and she would get really concerned and kind of hurry into the office trying to see what's going on, and realize that the door was unlocked. She didn't even need the key. And when she walked in, she was met by 2 FBI agents that were tearing through the files and overturning Gary's office completely. And it would be at this point that one of those 2 agents, who Sandy described as being the quote-unquote smaller individual, would stammer as she walked in and stop to offer kind of like a quick little bit of sympathy before smirking over to his partner and shaking his head. And all of this is taken directly again from Sandy Caradori's statement, for the record. And they would then hand her a subpoena demanding all of the evidence related to his Franklin sex ring investigation. And she would confront the men regarding the timing of this, since, it's one day after he's dead. But they would dismiss her, saying that Gary had been expecting this subpoena, a fact that she highly doubted, as her and Gary talked pretty much about everything, and he had made no mention of an FBI subpoena coming. The agent who had spoken to her was identified by her and multiple sources as being Special Agent Michael Mickey Mott. And Mott was a key FBI figure during the Franklin probe, and had been named by both Alicia Owen and Troy Bonner as one of the people who had pressured and intimidated them to change their story, and what led them to end up recanting. Well, Troy, not Alicia. Alicia stuck by her guns. And he would also attempt to discredit Caradori's work when he was called to testify in front of the legislative committee, and dismissed it as quote-unquote worthless, when he would later be confronted for being the main person who intimidated Bonner. And I say Bonner, it's spelled Boner, and I've seen interviews where he says Boner, but I didn't think I could get through the entirety of the episode calling him Troy Boner. I'm sorry, maybe that's childish of me, but I didn't. We're gonna say Bonner. We're just gonna say Bonner. So anyways, I digress. He was the main person that intimidated Bonner. And after his brother's death, he would refute the claim, saying that Bonner had, quote, lost all credibility. And the other agent who was there that day was either redacted from what few mentions I was able to find in the paperwork, or completely omitted. And he also never told Sandy his name. All the sources that I found acknowledged that several boxes worth of material were seized that day. The official paperwork lacks any sort of an evidence log, which is highly suspicious, and whatever it was never logged into evidence later either. Well, at least not officially. But, we're smart. We can make educated guesses here. And based on John DeCamp and Nick Bryant's work, as well as all of the contemporary sources, which all seem to agree that, quote-unquote, all records were taken. So that would include investigative files, photos, tapes, victim interviews, the flight logs for the Y&R Airlines trafficking flights, names of the abused children, and evidence that Caradori was known to possess involving that satanic cult element, DC connections, and a 1983 image of Alan Baer and Troy Bonner in explicit acts, which I actually only found out about doing the research for this portion. Also known to be in his possession at the time were checks linking the abusers to the victims, and leads on the pornography ring and the interstate child trafficking. Senator Schmidt, who hired Caradori, would submit an affidavit later stating direct threats to Caradori's life and his suspicions about his crash, and implying that the evidence seizure was to bury the evidence that Gary had gathered. If you remember, we talked about Bill Colby in the second episode. He's the ex-CIA director who also met a pretty suspicious end, would also reportedly tell DeCamp that the crash was likely sabotage, and that the briefcase with key files vanishing from the wreckage was no accident. Possibly most damning is the fact that whatever evidence they seized that day never again saw the light of day, despite never being used in any further FBI investigations, at least that we know of, and any info related to the evidence seizure or its contents thereof have been repeatedly denied in FOIA filings. It's pretty clear that they're never going to give us a definitive list of what all that they took or what all happened to what they took. And as far as those FOIA filings go, the ones that I've seen most often cited for that are like Exemption 6-7C, which are privacy protections. They don't want to give away somebody's home address or phone number, or somebody that's still alive, not involved, something like that. It's definitely overused though. Exemption 7D, which is for confidential sources or informants, or Exemption 7E, which is definitely one of the most abused, citing law enforcement techniques that could be circumvented if revealed. And the one that I ran into, which really stood out to me because it doesn't make a lot of sense, good old Exemption 1, meaning that the info was classified under executive order or its release could damage national security. Let's pause there for just a second. Why would documents pertaining to a child sexual abuse scandal or Gary Caradori's death, both events that happened over 35 years ago, how could that compromise national security? Kind of weird, that's all I'm saying. The other ones seem like they're clearly excuses at this point, but Exemption 1 opens a much bigger can of worms. I have my belief as to why they would use that exemption, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think about it. So drop a comment, give me your take, or shoot me an email. I'd truly love to know what your thoughts on all of that are. Moving on to the second piece of compelling evidence that I've left out. It actually occurred years after the whole carefully crafted hoax narrative had been pushed out and effectively buried the entire scandal under a blanket of official denials and media hit pieces. Occurred starting in mid-1993 with Yorkshire Television of the UK, who are they're a well-known media group for investigative documentaries. They did First Tuesday and This Week. They've covered a lot of very controversial topics, good, hard-nosed journalistic work. And they would send a top documentary team, headed up by British investigative journalist Tim Tate, to Nebraska to interview key figures and to try to uncover everything that they could on the Franklin scandal and child trafficking. Yorkshire TV had a well-earned reputation for hard-hitting journalism, and they had previously put out exposés on topics, like I said, like the IRA and international corruption rings. Stuff that was pretty spicy. I mean, they were known to not back down on things like that. So they were well-versed in dealing with sensitive and potentially explosive topics. The Discovery Channel actually had been the ones to reach out to them, and they asked them to produce the documentary as part of a series of investigative pieces that they were doing. You know, back when Discovery would actually do some degree of real, actual journalism. And if you weren't alive back then or old enough to remember them ever doing that, this story would be one of the last examples, and likely why you don't remember that. Among those on the Yorkshire team were consultants familiar with the scandal. It's believed John DeCamp acted as sort of a consultant on the film, you'd say. The filming would take place in late 93 to early 94, and they would capture exclusive interviews with the victims, like Alicia Owen, Paul Bonacci, Franklin committee members like Senator Loran Schmidt. The production, which was financed by the Discovery Channel, cost anywhere an estimated $90,000 to $120,000 to produce, which is pretty typical for an hour-long investigative documentary at that time. They would title the documentary Conspiracy of Silence, a name that would soon drip with irony. The documentary would wrap up in early spring of 1994 and was scheduled to be released on May 3rd of that year. Yorkshire returned to the UK, all seemed well, that is, until a few days before the scheduled release date, when it would abruptly be pulled from the schedule. Multiple sources, including first-hand accounts from journalists and the director Tim Tate, as well as a later edition mentioned in John DeCamp's The Franklin cover-up book, all seemed to indicate that the decision to pull it was due to intense external pressure, and that came from, quote, powerful people or entities with influence over the Discovery Channel, though no specific names, to my knowledge at least, were ever directly implicated. I'll tell you why in just a minute. Forces such as politicians, corporations, or agencies are all suspected but never officially named. Discovery's official stance was equally vague, just citing concerns about the documentary's, quote, controversial nature or legal threats, but no public lawsuits or formal legal challenges ever surfaced to justify the pulling. But then again, why would they? They got what they wanted. While the very upper end of documentaries at that time had yet to even crack the $200,000 mark, I was able to find anyway, and most agree that this one cost far less than that. Yorkshire Television would be paid at least $500,000 for their work, but it came with some very suspicious and specific conditions for the settlement. Imagine that. Those terms included 1. A gag order would be in place preventing Yorkshire Television or Tim Tate from discussing the documentary publicly or pitching the idea to any other network ever. 2. Along with that was a written agreement not to distribute it or any footage or audio obtained during the course of the investigation anywhere else. And in my opinion, the most telling caveat of all, 3, a requirement that all remaining copies of the film, including any related footage, master tapes, or working edits, and any and all backups of the material be completely and irreversibly destroyed. So considering the payment size, far exceeding anything previously seen for a documentary of that type, along with the requirements of the settlement, it strongly suggests that it wasn't just intended to compensate them for a documentary that never ever even aired, but rather to ensure their silence and their adherence to the terms of that offer. So I ask you guys, who could have exerted such pressure onto a network like Discovery and also compelled them to not only pull it off the schedule before ever airing, but to ensure that it, to the best of their ability, was completely and totally erased from history? I don't have a definitive answer to that question. I can only say what speculation and those that were closest to the story at the time have suggested. First on that list would be those most strongly implicated in the documentary, so Nebraska and DC elites, including figures that were tied to the Republican Party and lobbying circles who likely were compromised by King and Spence. Pressure, likely in part at least, came down to the politicians and political operatives fearing some sort of reputational damage, if I had to take a guess. Considering the direct involvement, or at the very least involvement in the cover-up, FBI and or intelligence agencies have to also be considered. This belief was actually held by the camp, who referenced their likely involvement after seizing Caradori's evidence and actively dismissing his work and the case as a whole. Some people have also suggested that given Discovery was a growing cable network at that time, they may have faced or feared backlash from advertisers or some sort of those legal challenges that we spoke of earlier that never seemed to materialize. I tend to put less stock in that one. Simply because it was Discovery that reached out to Yorkshire TV in the first place and asked them to create the documentary. Surely they had to have some idea of what kind of content they would be getting back. My only consideration to that, I guess, that I would add is if they were approached initially by people involved or just took it upon themselves to have it made in hopes that they were able to, further squash any kind of belief in the legitimacy of the story and, perpetuate the already present media blackout of it, and discrediting campaign that went on. But then when they received it, they realized that it would have the opposite effect, so they decided to can it. That's the only way I could see that really being a factor in it. Even that is brought into question though, because they didn't reject it when they got it, which is kind of what made that stand out to me. They waited until the very last minute to pull it, and for what it's worth, even they have alluded to them pulling it due to external pressures. All that Tim Tate was even allowed to say is that it was due to external pressure, but he couldn't elaborate further due to the legal restraints that were related to that gag order. The only reason that we know it even exists is thanks to a bootleg copy that, against all odds, somehow survived the order to destroy all the material that was related to it. And that bootleg would end up being leaked out. It would surface sometime in the mid-90s. Initially, and it was just being copied and circulated among Franklin case researchers and activists who were interested in the story. And it's a low quality VHS, like a VHS transfer, I guess what you'd say, suggesting that it was most likely just a working copy. It definitely wasn't the final edit of it. And many have suggested that it could have been an early version that was either given to or obtained by John DeCamp while he was consulting on it. And he has often been pointed to and credited as the source of the leak, though he has never confirmed that publicly or anywhere that I could find, as I'm sure that he probably can't. I'm sure he's somewhat beholden to that agreement as well. But however it survived, by like mid-2000s, the documentary had spread prolifically online, basically through like peer-to-peer networks and then later in platforms like YouTube and archive sites. The version that remains is, I think, about 55 minutes long, and it includes raw footage, unpolished edits. It's got interviews with Owen, Bonacci, Schmidt, and others, like I said. Its impact, despite an unprecedented effort to try and suppress it, helped to keep the Franklin story alive, particularly among independent researchers, journalists, and conspiracy aficionados, I guess. And it's definitely helped to fuel even greater distrust in the official narrative. That the scandal was just a well-crafted hoax dreamed up by some damaged, attention-seeking kids. It was this very documentary, actually, that I stumbled across not too long after, in the wake of 9/11, when I was first really woken up to the reality of the world's machinations and how they frequently contrasted greatly with the official narratives that they were putting out. I guess that's what originally piqued my interest in this case, and I definitely went down a long rabbit hole with it at that time, and that led me to several others that were very similar, one or two that we've talked about, and a few others that we will get into in part 3. But yeah. To recap, though, I held those two elements back because both are pretty clear-cut examples, in my opinion at least, of not just suppressing evidence, but attempting to destroy it altogether. They both also point to the possibility of powerful people, outside of the scope of just Franklin, stepping in to prevent evidence from escaping the containment zone that they kind of built around the entire scandal. In the case of Caradori's files and his evidence that not only vanished from the crash site, but was seized openly and on the record by the FBI in broad daylight, seemingly to ensure that neither committee had the whole story and none of it ever saw the light of day. And like that evidence, the now ironically titled Conspiracy of Silence was itself silenced by some manner of conspiracy and never intended to be seen again. Both of those incidents really raised the same question, though. What exactly were they all so determined to hide? Especially if, in fact, the child trafficking ring and blackmail allegations were just some carefully crafted hoax that they insisted they were. Well, in part 3, we're going to seek to try to answer all of those lingering questions by examining the network that might just explain why this story, and so many like it, were so strongly dismissed and deeply buried, as well as how and why they always seem to repeat. Before we switch over and discuss a little bit of news, have any of you all seen Conspiracy of Silence? If so, what stood out to you guys the most about it? I'm going to put a poll on the Spotify page for this episode, and comments, are always open and nice to get, so let me know. I'd love to hear about it. But for now, let's go ahead and get into some news. And welcome back to the news portion of tonight's show. Haven't done this in a while. Let's see how it goes. Our first story tonight is on a topic that I've previously reported on, but with some recent developments. And just so we're all on the same page here, I'm going to go ahead and explain what it is that I'm talking about a little bit. And I guess the best way to do that is probably just to talk about the Pegasus project. That was launched back in July of 2021 by a group called Forbidden Stories, along with 17, I think, media partners, and with some technical support from Amnesty International Security Lab. They were working in collaboration to expose the widespread misuse of NSO Group's Pegasus spyware. It's also known as NSO Group Technologies, which was founded in 2010 and is an Israeli cyber intelligence firm known primarily for their Pegasus spyware, which was marketed as a tool to sell to governments to help with terrorism and crime and things of that nature. But it would quickly begin being implicated in widespread surveillance of journalists, activists, and even many politicians, which sparked global controversy. NSO was named so after its founders' initials. They are Niv Karmi, Omri Lavey, and Shalev Julio. I doubt that I pronounced even one of those correctly, but their prior venture, Communitake, allowed for remote cell phone access with the user's permission. After interest from an unnamed European intelligence agency, I think we all probably have a guess, they would pivot to create Pegasus, a tool that allowed for unauthorized remote access to any cell phone in the world. Founder Niv Karmi, it bears mentioning, was formerly Mossad and military intelligence, and its research team is primarily comprised of ex-Israeli military intelligence from Unit 8200. The group's funding is an entire rabbit hole into itself, with ownership transferring around as it typically does in intelligence front fashion. And now that we've got a little background on who's responsible for it, let's look at what exactly Pegasus does. Essentially, Pegasus is what's known as a zero-click exploitative, sometimes Trojan, spyware, capable of infiltrating Android and iOS devices, accessing messages, contacts, location data, passwords, and as well as activating cameras and microphones. So yeah, they're totally listening to you. And it uses exploits similar to the 2019 WhatsApp vulnerability, CVE 2019-3568, to self-install without the need or the knowledge of the user. NSO faced significant backlash over it, but in typical trust me bro fashion, they would claim that it is only being sold to, quote, authorized governments, or whatever that means, for fighting crime and terrorism, with all exports regulated by Israel's Ministry of Defense. Which I guess is meant to be reassuring. If it is, I'd refer you back to last season's series on the Octopus and Promise software scandal. Despite their best trust me bro, evidence shows misuse against non-criminals in over 50 different countries. If you're curious, yes, of course the US is one of those. While NSO insists that it's a crucial tool for national security, and touting examples like it's used to help capture El Chapo, and extremely vague claims that they make about thwarting terrorism threats, a long string of abuses tend to indicate otherwise. The company insists that it does not play any active role in user targeting, and that it has actually canceled contracts with 10 different governments like Saudi Arabia and Dubai, so the Muslim nations, okay, makes sense, for what it calls severe abuses such as hacking Princess Hayya of Dubai. It's Haya, you tell me guys, sorry, I don't know that one. While there was a brief, minimized bit of outrage when the existence of Pegasus first was reported in July of 2021, it was quickly forgotten by most and buried under the coverage of COVID. These reports outlined how non-criminals were being targeted. I mean, is anyone surprised by that? And how the practice was a clear threat to freedom of the press, freedom of speech, dissidents, and the democratic opposition to those in power. On the 20th of that July, it would be reported at least 14 heads of state were current or former targets of Pegasus. Also, later that same year, a list would leak with 50,000 phone numbers that were listed as targets. When those numbers were analyzed by Forbidden Stories, along with their 17 media partners, it would be what revealed that Pegasus was being used to target journalists, activists, and heads of state in several countries. There would also be legal challenges, like the WhatsApp lawsuit, which is still ongoing to the best of my knowledge. In May of this year, a U.S. court ordered the NSO to pay $167 million in punitive damages and $440,000 in compensatory damages, ruling NSOs liable for violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act as well as WhatsApp's TOS. El Faro journalists would also sue over 226 Pegasus infections targeting their iPhones and sources. Citing national security risk, the U.S. Commerce Department added NSO to its entity list, citing national security risk over it being used against U.S. diplomats, journalists, and activists. Unsurprisingly, NSO did what Zionists do best, besides blackmail, and lobbied Congress to reverse the ruling, spending over $1 million in the process, arguing that it was vital for conflicts like Gaza. I said I was going to be nice in this one. I made a promise I wasn't even going to comment on that. I'm not going to do it. Depositions acquired from the WhatsApp lawsuit revealed that NSO, not its clients, operate Pegasus directly, which also directly contradicts their previous claims. The software has been linked to some high-profile human rights abuse cases as well, like the incident with Princess Hayya, and the tracking of Jamal Khashoggi, which led to his violent abduction and death. Israel's government, through the Ministry of Defense, regulates Pegasus exports, using them as diplomatic leverage, which suggests state complicity in its misuse. Around 200 journalists from 24 countries have been targeted thus far. One of the first to speak out about it, bear with me on the pronunciation here, Lujain al-Hafoul, a Saudi women's rights activist, was placed on Pegasus targets list in 2018, shortly before she was abducted, arrested, and subsequently tortured. The list of violations and misuse are ever increasing, with no real end in sight. The loopholes are plentiful, and as long as governments and corporations exploit them, Pegasus will continue to be used as a tool to silence dissenting voices from the shadows. It slips right through borders, to spy on anyone that's daring to challenge the powerful around the world, and it needs no passport, no visa, just a simple command. The only things that can hope to stop this digital predator are to remember that it's out there, and for the growing collective outrage to continue. For now, though, developments are ongoing, and as always, I'll report back with any updates as they become available. Which brings us to our top story for the evening. And when I set out to put these stories together for tonight, I had absolutely no intention of even covering Israel, because I honestly feel that I probably said enough, possibly too much. Only time will tell. But some stories, though, especially if they echo topics that I'm already covering, are just a little too big for me to just ignore. So our top story for tonight is just such a story, as I'm sure you've no doubt heard about by now. Earlier in this month, Nevada's Internet Crime Against Children Task Force completed a sting operation that led to the arrest of 8 individuals. All of the suspects thought that they were meeting with minors when undercover officers intercepted them and Chris Hansen their ass. They would all be arrested, brought to the jail at Las Vegas Metro Police Department, which participated in the operation alongside local, state, and federal officials. One of the more notable captures was of 46-year-old Las Vegas Redemption Church pastor Neil Harrison Creasy, who reportedly believed that he was meeting a 14-year-old boy. The other notable name that was caught up in this sting was Israeli National Cyber Directorate head Tom Artyom Alexandrovich, who believed that he was meeting a 15-year-old girl for, quote, sexual contact. And according to officers involved, even brought a condom with him. How thoughtful. The sting operation was aimed at online users seeking to sexually prey on children. Details of this arrest would come out after accusations that the U.S. government played a role in releasing the Israeli official, which the State Department denies. Officially, he was booked and released on a $10,000 bond with a court date, but he was allowed to immediately return to Israel despite their history with granting a safe harbor for Jewish pedophiles fleeing U.S. justice. In the official statement from the State Department, they acknowledge all of that, and that the court date is for charges of soliciting sex electronically from a minor. They would add, quote, he did not claim diplomatic immunity and was released by a state judge pending a court date. Alexandrovich, who worked directly under Benjamin Netanyahu, is listed on the Israeli government website as the head of the Technology Defense Division at Israel National Cyber Directorate. He was apparently in the area after attending the Black Hat Briefings, a yearly meeting of cybersecurity professionals. Considering that he got busted for online solicitation of a minor, I can only assume that he probably sucks at that job. Israeli outlets would put out mixed reporting on the incident, but all reported that he was returned to Israel safely, with some quoting Netanyahu's office as denying the arrest, saying only that a, quote, state employee was, quote, questioned by American authorities during his stay and that he had returned to Israel as scheduled. It's been reported that he is now on leave from the INCD by way of a mutual decision. If either of these stories interest you, let me know, and I'll report back on them as new developments become available. And either way, I'll be following them both closely regardless. And that's about it. That's pretty much all I've got for you tonight. I really just kind of wanted to hit on those 2 points from earlier that I left out of the episode, because I do think that they provide context that will kind of help where we're going in part 3. But I hope you all are having an amazing week so far out there. And like I said at the start, I'm shooting to have part 3 of this Franklin series out in 2 weeks from tonight, provided everything goes smoothly, and you never know, but that's my goal. I have an absurd amount of documents that I'm still poring over, and with more on the way, hopefully. But I've got the outline together, and a majority of the actual research is already done, so really I'm just finishing that up, writing and fact-checking, and I'll be ready to lay it all out for you pretty soon. So, shouldn't be more than 2 weeks. I hope that you all have enjoyed the series so far. I mean, as much as you can. I know it's pretty heavy at times, but fully understanding the Franklin case, it's really crucial for what comes next in part 3. As always, tons of documents are in the Discord chat for you if you're interested. Links on the Spotify page, Facebook, wherever else. Anyways, take care of yourselves out there. Take care of one another if you can. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.